So this is my video for the Chapter 1 readings from last week and the case study that we've read about Hockaday. For the first question, it asks us to apply each of the components of communication competency to Hockaday responders. So, as you'll recall from Chapter 1, the components of communication competency are knowledge, sensitivity, skills, and values. Knowledge is the ability to understand the organizational communication environment. And I think at Hockaday, because they were in the middle of a lot of change and moving from their other team-based system to a self-directed virtual team, they didn't take the time to really understand how that would affect their ability to communicate. The next one is sensitivity, which is the ability to sense organizational meaning and feeling accurately. On the virtual team, there were members from all different regions and all different parts of the globe. Therefore, I think that some of it may have been lost in translation. For example, when they were dealing with the first event, there was a time where Mary had to redirect the team because they started speaking in multiple language instead of the English that they had agreed upon. The third component of communication competency is skills, which is the ability to analyze situations accurately and to initiate and consume organizational messages effectively. And at Hockaday, I feel like there wasn't enough downward communication from the top leadership, and I think that that may have been partly to blame for some of the issues that they ran into. Another problem was the lack of face-to-face meetings on a regular basis. When we were in our professional communications course last quarter, it talked about virtual teams, and one of the things that they mentioned as being important is the regular face-to-face meetings. Even if they have to be digital, nowadays you can have a face-to-face meeting without really having to meet in the same space. And then, of course, the last component of communication competency is values, which is taking responsibility for effective communication, therefore contributing to organizational excellence. And I think at Hockaday, the only time they really incorporated the idea of the competency of values is when everything got crazy and they had that first event. Then you saw some communication from the top management team. And I think that may have been partially to blame for the situations that occurred. The second question is, how would you apply the concept of excellence in communication to the various situations at Hockaday responders? So I think that they started out well enough, but when they were put under pressure, they struggled a little more because they didn't take the time to set up the procedures and practices that they would have in the event of an emergency like the one that happened in the U.S. They needed to have, like I said before, more regular face-to-face meetings. The multiple languages thing can be a barrier. And then different time zones, especially in the crisis. I know there's not a whole lot you can do about different time zones when you're in a crisis situation because you don't plan for those. So, but one thing they could have done to kind of help with that overall throughout the entire thing was to be more aware and schedule regular meetings around the different time zones, set up a Google poll, figure out what time works best for everybody on the team. And another issue that kind of didn't help them be excellent in communication was the rotating leadership. When I was in project management last quarter, as a team, we wanted to do a rotating leadership. And we were instructed that that doesn't work very well because there's a lack of consistency and the communication lines break down. And also, you have people who may not be as interested in being a leader as some others. And so one of the things I think that caused some of their problems was the lack of stability in leadership. Moving on to the third question, it says, apply the concept of communication as constituting organizations to Hockaday responders. So on page 1.11.5, the authors talk about the concept of communication constituting organizations. Organizational communication is different than interpersonal in that it is more comprehensive, including both one-on-one conversations as well as group exchanges. At Hockaday, the quickly changing technology and the rapidly growing client base have made that process more challenging. Moving on to the fourth question, it says, describe the major organizational challenges that they faced based on discussion of the individual and organizational challenges. So a big challenge that they faced was communication context, the environment for the interaction. It states clearly in the case multiple times that they relied very heavily on technology and had no face-to-face interaction. And I think that heavy reliance on the technology without having regular meetings really affected the communication context because the environment for the interaction was not ideal. Another thing that kind of held them up was rapidly changing technology. In the case, it states that they had gotten a new software diagnostic tool right before the inception of the team. And I think that that may have been part of the problem since that was designed to catch problems and it didn't catch that first problem. They also have an expanding client base. So not only do they have a diversity on the team and the effects of globalization, but that also is affecting their client base, which can be a strength that they do have the diversity to deal with the different client base. But at the same time, it can cause some communication barriers. Another thing that the case mentioned is that Rugio felt like they didn't need any additional training because they were the best of the best. However, if they had had additional training, especially on that new software diagnostic tool, they may have been more successfully able to deal with that first event. And then, of course, the last one is changing organizational forms, which basically means going from one structure to another structure. And because they've done self-directed teams before, and that worked, they thought that the self-directed virtual teams would work much the same way. However, the difference lies in the fact that the self-directed work teams actually were all in the same regional center and met regularly face-to-face, whereas on the virtual team, they weren't doing that. Moving on to the Chapter 2 section questions. The first one says, apply the basic concepts of the functional approach to organizational communication to Hockaday responders. So some of the questions that were in the chapter under the functional approach was how effective are organizing, relationship, and change messages? I think one area that Hockaday struggled in is they had no change message from the top once the team was established. Very little direction. However, that is the point with a self-directed team. But between that and not having a stable leadership because they were doing the rotating leadership, the two combined was just a little too much when it came to how effective their organized relationship and change messages were. Another question that's asked in the functional section is channel use appropriate? And I would say that more often than not, when you're on a virtual team, you're using technology rather than meeting face-to-face. However, I think if they had more face-to-face meetings, which it sounds like they instituted at the end, I think that'll really help them to be more successful and have a more functional type of communication. And then, of course, does the organization get good input communication from the environment? Well, as I stated before, they had started a new software diagnostic tool that was supposed to alert them to problems, and it did not work the way it was supposed to. The first issue was caused by the software not catching the problem, and so the team had to convene in a crisis situation and figure out what they could do to fix that problem. It actually ended up being something on the client side. But by that point, it made Hockaday look like they were responsible for the situation. And so if the diagnostic software had been able to catch that, and maybe if they had received some additional training, they may have been able to work through that a little quicker than the 7 hours that it took them to come up with an answer for that. The next question asks us to describe the Hockaday responders group from the meaning centered perspective. So meaning centered is basically the process of creating shared realities. And some of the questions that the textbook mentions is, do most members identify? And I would say that initially they did identify okay, but over time, many of them shared, especially in that last employee satisfaction survey, that they felt disconnected. They were more a part of the regional center that they worked at rather than a part of the virtual team itself. And I think this could have been remedied, like I said, with some more face-to-face interaction, maybe meeting at least twice a year in real time, in real space. Another question that's asked under meaning centered is, how can the communication climate be characterized? So some of the problems were that there was not enough downward communication or supervision. There was no real face-to-face meetings where they could do logistical planning, and that makes it ineffective and it needs adjustments. However, that being said, at the end of the case, it kind of talks about some of the changes they were going to make, and I thought that most of them sounded like it would help. So the third question says to identify the concepts from emerging perspectives that make the most sense to you when thinking about Hockaday responders. So the emerging perspectives is basically where you expand on new ideas, you critique old ideas, and you challenge the basic assumptions that have always existed. Some of the things that they're doing at Hockaday really fall under the emerging perspectives. The idea of a self-directed team, I would say, is from the emerging perspectives. Globalization, how they have everything set up so that they have regional centers all throughout the globe. And then, of course, postmodernism. A lot of the ideas that they're doing are they're challenging the old ways of doing things and trying to learn some new ways and some new ideas to think about things in a different way. So moving on to question 4, it says, how can you combine the information in each of the 3 major perspectives in Chapter 2 to best illustrate what has happened and what is happening at Hockaday Responders? And I think what happened is they didn't spend enough time organizing and planning. And had they spent a little more time in that area, as well as some decision making, they could have had contingency plans in place that would have helped them deal with the 2 events that were discussed in the case. I think that using the emerging perspective ideas that they're using is working for them. They just need a little fine tuning, and using some of those the tools in the functional perspective could help them more clearly define what that looks like for them. Moving on to 5, which single idea or concept from Chapter 2 is the most meaningful to you for this case, and why? I think the most meaningful one for me was the context, the communication context. The environment for the interaction wasn't an ideal environment for the problems that they were challenged with. But at the end of the case, it sounds like they had kind of worked out some things. They wanted to increase the size of the team to 11 members. They started having more regular face-to-face meetings. And I think that it'll be interesting to see, like if we do more stuff with this case later on, how those changes actually affected the effectiveness of their communication context. And that's kind of my take on this case. It was an interesting case. There was a lot of information, and I felt like a lot of information wasn't really there. So you just kind of had to assume some things. So I will talk to you all later. Thanks.